Hello and welcome back to the IPA's Looking Forward, a weekly podcast of debate and discussion about politics and ideas. We've got another great show for you today. We're unpacking the mass media campaign around so-called right to know and protections for journalists. We raised the alarm bells over proposed laws to govern truth in advertising during elections, and we trawl through recent Nobel Prize winners and their ideas for how to generate economic growth in the developing world. To help me through this, I have my co-host from RMIT University, Dr. Chris Berg.
G'day, Scott.
Good to have you, mate. Research fellow at the IPA, Andrew Bushnell.
Cheers, Scott.
And first-time Looking Forward panellist, Pete Gregory.
Mate, I'm very happy about being invited to the Big Kids podcast. I obviously missed the email about the dress code, but no, look, very excited. Let's do it.
It's so
Let's
good
look
to have you,
forward.
mate.
Dress code about what you wear when you come into the office?
I'm dressed. We're recording the Young IPA podcast after this, so I'm dressed for that. Obviously. Normally I wear a three-piece
You
suit
actually
to work.
live in this studio. You've got just that's your little cot over there.
That's
and
right.
Just lurch from podcast to podcast.
Giving the people what they want, you know.
Yeah,
so.
no, good to have you, mate. And we've got some great questions for you later on in one of the segments. And also we have our Books and Culture segment, as always. Today we look at the late Harold Bloom's masterwork on the Western Canon, the memoirs of the so-called whistleblower Edward Snowden, classic movie To Live and Die in LA, sort of movie you watch when you're up at 3 a.m. with a crying baby, and the latest season of the Brummy crime drama Peaky Blinders.
Everyone can tell that one's mine.
Yeah.
So, the pop culture trashy one. That's Gregory's.
Yeah, no, that's good.
One's pretty low rent as well.
Yeah, here's the one with the baby. Don't forget, both podcasts, his and ours, is brought to you by the Institute of Public Affairs. If you're not already a member, do go to ipa.org.au and join or donate. We are going to kick off this week with a very topical issue. All the major daily newspapers and many other media outlets have joined together this week to put the focus on a so-called Right to Know campaign. A couple of months ago, back in June on this podcast, it was very hot. We had Australian Federal Police raids on journalists. We had a discussion, which actually was a full-on debate almost between the two gentlemen on my left about right to know versus national security considerations in that particular case. But Chris Berg, what's being asked for this week by the media organisations?
That's right. Well, what isn't being asked for? So you pointed out that this is a very topical campaign. It's topical because the press has made it topical. They get to decide what is topical and what is not. So on Monday, all the front pages of every major Australian newspaper were blacked out as part of the media's, what they're calling the Right to Know campaign, as you say. So that's all the 9 newspapers, The Guardian, all the News Corp newspapers, the ABC, Prime Media, 7 West Media, Sky News, SBS, Channel 10, and the Win Network as well. As you've pointed out, the press is pushing for stronger protections of what they describe as press freedom in the wake of the recent leak investigations that we debated back in episode 21. They have a range of proposals, some of which I'm sympathetic for, some of which I think are a little bit questionable. But the highlights are they want to be able to contest search warrants. They want stronger protections for whistleblowers, so that's government employees who are blowing the whistle when they talk to the press. They want restrictions on government secrecy. They want reform to the freedom of information laws, which are, of course, the laws that allow them to request documents out of from government agencies, and the government agencies are very resistant to that, or typically quite resistant to that. They want exemptions for journalists from prosecution from a number of national security laws, and they want defamation law reform as well. Look, I think we should bat around some of the specifics about this, but Pete, the IPA has been quite interested in the FOI proposal for obvious reasons, because the IPA has tried to use those FOI laws against some of the government media, haven't they, Pete?
That's right, Chris. We use FOIs all the time, and I'm sure there's very deep points about this, but the first point you have to make about every big political topic is the hypocrisy of the left. I have here, for those watching, a segment, and John Roscombe did this on the Bolt Report during the week.
It is a visual gag. We'll
gag.
We'll describe it in a moment.
It's a component of an FOI request we made to the ABC about why we aren't invited to The Drum, which is a show on the ABC. For those watching, for those listening, it is completely blanked out the whole page that appears to be 47C. It's just one part of it. So if the ABC can't tell us why we aren't on a television program, it's a bit hypocritical for them to ask that, national security secrets be spread to the people of Australia.
Well,
no, I'm sort of sympathetic to this.
Isn't that one of Robert Conquest's laws that everyone is conservative about things they know most about? So the ABC fervently agrees that government agencies other than themselves should be made to give more information.
Yeah, well, I mean, look. There shouldn't be a government agency that is also a media provider at the first instance. So that's the big problem. But sorry, Andrew, you were about to jump in.
It goes to this question about what transparency about what. When we talk about the government being transparent, which parts of it should be transparent? Their argument in effectively denying our freedom of information request is that they don't have to divulge information that goes. It's an input into the production of the TV show.
TV show?
Yeah. They only have to divulge. the results.
It's not quite cabinet level security, is what I'm saying.
And for the ABC, their outputs are actually a $1 billion media network. So their outputs are all publicly available. That's their argument. I think there is a question about whether it's a good thing to demand transparency about inputs, just in general. We know this when we think about, say, corporations or businesses trying to develop innovations, innovative products or innovative processes. They want to, because that's their intellectual property, they want to keep that secret. They don't actually want transparency about that. And the same thing kind of goes into the policy making process within government. So I wonder if there's like a distinction here that gets kind of conflated perhaps in like a huge omnibus proposal like this one, between access to information and your ability to mouth off about information that you have.
I think surely there's a strong distinction between a corporation's internal decision-making processes and the government's internal decision-making process. But I do take your more general point that certainly at the cabinet level or in the United States we would say executive privilege. So the decisions, the conversations that allow the executive to come to a decision. You can understand there's a really practical utilitarian reason to protect them from disclosure because you want people to be able to share ideas that won't be on the front page of the Australian in 24 hours. So I can understand that, but I think what and the media doesn't go through that distinction very well because they just want more access to information. They want to be able to tell potential leakers, whether those are whistleblowers or whoever it is, that they are protected by laws X, Y, and Z. What I think is most obscene about these sorts of things goes to actually Pete's hypocrisy point, which you told as a joke, but is a very genuine one. It's not just about the ABC, it's about the idea that journalists get exemptions to general laws at all.
Yeah, exactly.
Like, I am bound by national security laws, whether I like them or not, and there's a lot of them that I don't like. I'm bound to them. Why? And we have a podcast.
Yeah, exactly.
We are also, quote, the media in some sense. If I tweet a lot, then I am also the media.
Is a YouTuber a journalist?
Yeah, well, exactly. So and there are downstream consequences for that. So if the journalists get what they want, then suddenly you've got to have government departments saying who is and isn't a journalist. But I just find the mindset despicable. The idea that there is a class of people who don't have to obey general laws.
One of the things that we saw in this, when the media got together, and it's a group of journalists, and it's a profession. It is a profession, and good luck to them. We hope that it's never a registered profession. That's why we oppose the Finkelstein proposals, and thought it was just outrageous. Still do that. Journalists were getting around them because they liked that idea of being registered and start to build the sort of exclusions that, say, pharmacists have or whatever. But their myth making came to the fore because professions do have to have their myths, and it's about brave.
no more than journalists.
Brave journalists, against the world. Post Watergate, they all want to be Woodward and Bernstein, and we've discussed how that brought down journalists. And so even though there was that laundry list of things that you just read out, all I actually heard in all the interviews from all of these outlets was the special role of journalists, the special service that they give to democracy. In fact, there can't be democracy without journalists, was essentially the claim. Therefore, they must be privileged over and above everybody else. And so even though they have a laundry list, which, as you say, has some good ideas in it, none of that actually survived, beyond the first 24 hours before they just went into this sort of reverie about telling each other how good they are and how important their profession is.
So what is it that we do like about this list? And I'll start with Andrew and then maybe Pete.
No, I think that
Well, what should we do in general?
I would say that the proposal to weaken Australia's defamation laws is something that could probably attract widespread support among the public. Of course, politically, it's one of the hardest parts of it
because everybody wants to buy a swimming pool.
Because the defamation law protects essentially, who we would call the elite, right? People who are in the public eye, who have positions of influence. Defamation law primarily protects them, and they are the ones who have to make a decision about whether to weaken these laws or not. So the political prospects of that are basically in inverse proportion to how sensible they are. And so I think that aspect of it, and
you could say the same thing about the whole list, though, to be fair.
Defamation law is one of these things that goes to this ability to talk about things that are in the public space. So it's not binding it up with a debate about how effective for democracy transparency is and all of this stuff is actually kind of unhelpful, because the defamation law argument would stand on its own 2 feet on a separate basis, which is just that we ought to be free to mouth off about people who are in positions of influence.
Pete, how would you address this?
Well, one thing I noticed about this, which sort of in preparation for this podcast, which made it a bit difficult, I think there's a bit of a lack of specificity in this. Like, I always come down on the side of government should be more transparent, but there is, some kind of role for government secrets. For example, we say new rules governing what information governments can deem secret, with obligations to regularly audit the material being kept from the public. Yeah, but it's like what new rules? So, without knowing what that is, how can you say whether you support it or not?
But there is an overclassification problem. Certainly, there is in the United States, and I believe there's one here as well.
Yeah, the way classification works is basically if you create a document, a government document in certain areas. So I used to work for the Department of Defence. You're in charge of classifying it, and you can basically put it as whatever classification you want. You can theoretically get in trouble for overclassifying things because... Has
anybody ever gotten in trouble?
No, you're more likely to get in trouble for underclassifying. So, writing something that is, say, secret on the wrong network is a problem, whereas the inverse is not as much of a problem. So there's a kind of perverse incentive there. But that's why you get this kind of overclassification, is that all the incentives within the secret-keeping parts of the bureaucracy are on the side of locking things up.
Yeah, I want to come back to journalists, because this...
We don't hate all journalists.
This is the actual motivation for this. So there's a laundry list of, issues which, come and go. But, of course, the AFP raids, and I can understand why it concentrates the mind of a journalist, getting him, knock on the door at 6 a.m.
Having your sock drawer rumbled through.
Yeah. Like, so notwithstanding anything I just said about the precious little darlings, I can understand where they're coming from. And but one of the things that's come out of this is Christian Porter then said, look, no journalists are being prosecuted unless I give the sign off. And this was,
that's not super comforting. No. I have to say.
And it's also, it turned out to be off message, because then Scott Morrison was off message because he stood up in Parliament and said no politician should be sitting in judgment on this, just after Christian Porter had actually dragged the powers back from the DPP. Now, the funny thing is, I actually like having the Attorney General accountable for all this. I mean, if this really is a fundamental issue that goes to the heart of our democracy, that's exactly where it should be. I mean, Andrew, you're a qualified lawyer, but you recall that once upon a time there were no such things as DPPs. There used to be political accountability for launching prosecutions and all these things. So they've shoveled it off all these bureaucrats, and I think they've quite rightly brought it back.
Yeah, I think that is definitely one thing that has kind of fallen by the wayside, is this idea that it's actually good to locate a particular power, particularly if it's controversial, in a person that you can identify and say, well, we got a bad result from the exercise of this power, so you're gone. Like that's exactly what democratic accountability should be. Now, on this question though about whether this is a particular power that that we want someone to exercise, I think comes down to what it is that we expect from a free press. Is it just that we think, as a natural right, say that we would like to talk about these things, that, or do we think, in a utilitarian sense, that we'll get better government from these kinds of laws? I mean, those two arguments are actually separate, right? One would just be that it's that you don't have the government or anyone else doesn't have the right to tell me what I can and can't talk about. Whereas another argument would be, well, actually by enabling that in a positive sense or enabling a particular kind of media, we get a better result from government.
There is a third one. The democratic argument is that the government has no right to prevent me knowing about what the democratic government is doing, presuming it's legitimate and all that sort of thing. So Pete, this campaign, which was launched on Monday, I think it's fair to say it hasn't really resonated with the public in any great detail. There's a
I haven't asked them, but I could. Yeah.
Down at cricket training, it's just like the big talking point.
No, it feels like a bit of a beltway issue.
A little beltway
Imagine if they
Twitter
blacked
issue.
out the sports section.
Yeah, they should have done that, and there would have been
Also,
outrage.
in the age
the
of digital
Sydney-
media,
this-
like who looks at a front page of an actual printed paper anymore?
I only saw this on Twitter, to be honest. The Sydney Morning Herald has a line which I really enjoyed. Privately, the Morrison government has indicated scepticism that media freedom is something that grabs the public's attention. How would you attribute that? So some would say. How would you explain that? So we are talking about certainly basic freedoms, where you think we're just talking about freedom of speech or media freedom. Why don't you think that this campaign has resonated, or do you think maybe it has?
Well, I think these things take a lot of time to sort of marinate into the public consciousness. I think when we raised 18C back in whenever that would happen, 2012 or whatever, freedom of speech wasn't a big issue for people, but freedom of speech has become a bigger and bigger issue for people in Australia and around the West on the back of, campaigning about it. And I think maybe people feel like their freedom of speech has been impinged upon. But, I mean, no one knew this was coming, I don't think, until Monday. And it's a difficult thing for the public to get their head around. So I think it would take time for people to, get around it. And also I think that trust in the press is actually pretty low at the moment. So maybe people don't care.
But it's that trust in the press that really gets me, because the what I loathe about this is that it's a coordinated campaign on a public policy issue when every other freedom of speech and liberty question has been treated by the press as like just a fun thing to debate. So 18C, we can write as many controversial columns as we want, and back and forth, and we'll debate this. It's a basic freedom, individual freedom to speak, but we can debate it. The sedition laws, the metadata, data retention laws, the encryption laws, the cash bans, Finkelstein banning websites just randomly and ad hoc in response to moral panics. All this stuff is just up for debate. The press will open its pages to every man and his dog, but on this, because it affects the press.
Well,
it's their freedom.
And people recognise that.
And I probably wrap it up with the comment that there is some irony in the Age and the Guardian, writing endless columns how terrible it is that the Murdoch press, that you could read in both the Telegraph and the Herald Sun and the Australian on the same day that, there was a clear Murdoch line that say corporate tax cuts were a good thing. And how outrageous it was that, News Corp might actually have a company line on an issue. So that's outrageous. But for every single newspaper in the country with multiple owners to all be saying the same thing.
Disgraceful coordination.
That's okay.
Collusion.
Yeah, that's right. Spontaneous order. Isn't it an amazing thing? Still on democracy and politics, there are other proposals floating around this week regarding... in the wake of the most recent federal election, truth in advertising laws when it applies to politics.
That's right. Every time there's an election, there's a parliamentary inquiry into the conduct of that election, and so everybody can air their grievances. Today or yesterday, we learned that one of those aired grievances is a joint submission by Jason Falinski, who is the Liberal MP for McKellar, alongside Zali Steggall, who is the independent MP for Wentworth, calling for truth in political advertising laws. And I'll give a quick quote from their joint submission, so it's co-signed by the both of them, Felinski and Steggall. While we can debate concerning competing definitions of, quote, truth, and Andrew, we will get into that, don't worry about it. Everyone can agree that an objective fact checker and minimal factual basis can elevate the national conversation concerning issues that, bear with me, concerning issues that matter to Australians and cut through the fake news, fake advertising, and fake political campaigning that demeans us all. They join alongside the Australia Institute, the green supporting think tank out of Canberra, in calling for these truth in advertising laws. They point out things like the Mediscare campaign, which was the claims that the Turnbull government was going to abolish Medicare, the Liberal ad saying that Labor was planning a car tax, and various examples like that. I'm sure we can all think of questionable claims made in political campaigns. The question is, Andrew, the first question is, do we need political truth in advertising laws? How do you view that?
Well, every now and then I walk past an ad, not necessarily a political ad, but any ad, and I think, that's just simply not true, right? So if you walk past like
deodorant won't help get you the girl.
Like a pharmacist, and it was like really? It was like an ad for, I won't say which company, but it was like an ad for like a supplement, and it was like, this is really vital for like teenage development or something. And I was like, well, this is extremely unlikely to be true, and I felt like just screaming like, tell me something true. Like I'm sick of being surrounded by things that are just obvious lies. And so, in that sense, I'm almost sympathetic, just in the sense that I too get fed up with having to adopt a skeptical disposition all the time in this society, because everything is
general
false.
Complaints about the human condition, though?
Well, that is the big question, because if there is such a thing as the truth, and what's interesting here about this is
I was joking when I said it.
No. It is actually
Do humans have a soul?
It's actually where my mind went on this. But in truth, the point that I'm making is that this sits kind of uneasily with at least some of the arguments that were made for the last topic about press freedom. If the idea is that a free press and free discussion somehow aids in the discovery of truth, such that we could pinpoint what that truth is, then you would have some basis for saying this ad is true or this ad is false. But if the argument is simply that quite apart from truth claims that government is more efficient, democracy is better, then when you're free to speak, then obviously there's no case for truth in political advertising laws, because any kind of political advertising tells you something, and that contributes to this free discussion.
Pete, what's your take?
This just strikes me as, we didn't like the Trump one, we didn't like the Brexit got up, we didn't like the ScoMo one. The only thing I can think of that explains this is they must be lying to the stupid people, because that's why they voted for them. It just feels like this elite thing that we didn't get what we want, so it must be because advertising isn't true.
Well, Jason Felinski won the election as a Liberal.
Yeah, well, that's good for Jason. But but in general, with the Australian, what are they called? The Australian Institute and the rest, it just feels, but the whole push for it feels like this kind
It's
of...
arguably because the Liberal Party is itself at least portraying itself inaccurately to the voters.
It's Liberal.
But I mean, it's also prissy. I mean, really, politicians will say or do anything to get elected. I mean, who knew?
Yeah, exactly right. That's exactly right. And it sort of assumes that people are stupid. I read through the Australian Institute report about it. I read the summary, and I read it, and I'm like, okay, I don't agree with that, because I'm a sort of laid back classical liberal type person, but there's some real home run examples coming. There's going to be this cracker example, which is going to really trouble me. But there wasn't. It was all like, there was signs in Chinese that looked like the Australian Electoral Commission signs, which were telling people how to vote. Like, are you saying Chinese people...
Which you would not catch under truth in advertising laws, to be clear, because it never claimed to come from the AEC.
Yeah, exactly right.
Indeed.
A Facebook group said Tanya Plibersek thinks that Indians can't create jobs in Australia. So, it doesn't say who it is. So some rubbish Facebook group that no one's a member of, it's hardly a big threat to our democracy.
Yeah,
So
and claims like, vote for the independent is like a vote for Labor, which is made, all the time on the basis that, say Julia Gillard, was able to be made Prime Minister through a vote for the Greens. So if the Liberals had said before the election a vote for the Greens is a vote for Labor, is that a lie?
So,
Are we going to have a group of bureaucrats sitting in judgment on whether that's a true statement?
So, well, okay.
It did say...
That's a good thing to raise. So we have political advertising laws in Australia, truth in advertising laws. The South Australian government has them, and the Electoral Commission, in fact, manages what constitutes a true a truth or a lie in advertising. In fact, the reason I know this is because there's a sentence in both the Australia Institute's report and the Jason Falinsky and Zali Stegel report that says, although the SA Electoral Commission is at times uncomfortable with its role as adjudicator of the truth, the South Australian example proves that factual accuracy in political advertising laws are possible without using a statutory body as arbiter.
Let's not just skip over that. There's the exact same sentence in
It's
both.
the exact same sentence.
Well,
what a coincidence.
That is perhaps that's all we can actually say because of some of the laws that we've been discussing. But
yeah, look,
what a coincidence!
Look, I mean, I'm not sure. Peter and I were talking earlier. I'm not sure that it would get through. Turnitin, which is the academic program, but there you go.
This is a looking forward scoop. Absolute scoop.
Anyway, same sentence in both. So the Australian Institute is trying to answer this question. So they don't want the Electoral Commission to do it at the national level. What they want to use is the Advertising Standards Board. And the Advertising Standards Board is, quote, a private agency that decides whether advertisements on Australian television are too rude, effectively.
It's not actually private though, is it?
No. I mean, it's empowered by legislative framework. In fact, I interviewed to be on the Advertising Standards Board many, many years ago. I was writing a lot about freedom of speech, and they called me up and said, "Do you want to interview for this position?" Because they need community people. And so
You're a community person.
Yeah, I was like 23 and just have strong opinions about freedom of speech. So I sit down. They flew me to Sydney. I sat down in their office, and they said, "Okay, so what would your philosophy be?" And I'd be like, "I really don't think we should prevent anything from
I don't think
being
this
shown
should
on
exist.
television."
I will vote for my own abolition as soon as I'm appointed to the board.
And they didn't really call me back, but
Funny about
I got
that.
a nice flight to
Is
Sydney.
it just as hard to pin down what a political advertisement is as what the truth is? I mean, it's just like
In this era of woke capitalism,
yeah, where everything, where the personal is political, and you have every ad like you can't even sell a razor without having to dress it up as some sort of political issue. Pinpointing exactly what a political ad is or an ad that has a political effect before you even get into like this question about the truth. What ads are we talking about?
Well, that's right, because one of this is again a lawyer, you might the proper name for the theory, I think, the normative theory of the law. This is what happens when laws go on the books. And because essentially the argument they've got here is there is a vast amount of law in consumer law, ACCC enforcing a vast amount of law about truth in advertising for all products other than politics. Therefore, isn't that a terrible thing that those laws don't also apply to politics? You can actually run that argument in reverse, that we're already completely over-regulated. It doesn't actually help us get to... They're not helping us get to the truth.
But truth...
It creates this huge compliance burden on everyone involved in the advertising business, creating products, working out the claims that they can make. Good for the lawyers, good for the compliance people that hang off all these companies. But it stifles innovation. It just empowers the ACCC. I'd be running all of these arguments exactly in reverse.
But there's an argument for them because truth in commercial advertising is better laws are better seen as fraud prevention. So they're trying not to scam you out of money. Now, a meta-scare campaign is more just asserting that we believe there is an intention.
But if you believe
for
that
diet
diet pills
Scam you out of
work,
your vote.
if you believe that diet pills work, then more fool you. At what point do they?
There's always a little caveat down the bottom. Does not work.
Yeah, well, I mean, is this going to include mere
conditions, obesity,
mere puffery? Does this include? So the common law standard is that there's lying and then there's mere sales puffery.
Mere puffery is always going to be a problem for you, and you're going to have to wander through life with your skeptical attitude.
No, I don't agree. I mean, if, for example, I was made king, then I wouldn't face this problem.
Now it comes out.
Yeah. So I mean, there's at least one scenario at the margin.
Go through that logic. So what happens when you're king?
Well, then I just declare what is true.
Yeah. Okay. Fair enough.
So there's at least, we can agree.
Yeah.
All people can objectively agree that there's at least one case in which I don't confront this problem.
What is interesting is that in the United States, where they've got really strong free speech, First Amendment jurisprudence, knowing lies is actually protected. So making a lie knowingly is a protected form of speech under the First Amendment. It's not perfectly protected by any means, because there are the standard exceptions like defamation and perjury and fraud and that sort of thing. But in a number of Supreme Court cases, the court has found that lying about, say, an attribute that you have is actually, is protected freedom of speech. The case in that, the most famous case in this area was the Stolen Valor Act, and the Stolen Valor Act prohibits people from wearing military medals that they're not entitled to. Mm-hmm. And the court struck that down, or struck parts of that down, because you are allowed to lie about having fought in Battle X and
because presumably what you'd have to establish for something to be an offence is harm. Yeah, if the act of lie leads to harm...
Yeah, it says it in the title. It's stolen valour. I mean, they're trying to tell a story of harm, and I think you could tell a story of harm.
No, but that's what I mean. Like, it's not saying that if your lie led to some harm being caused, that you are still not accountable for that. It's just saying that the lie in itself is not an offence.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Well, I think we're allowed to have laws that look inconsistent on the surface but have a deeper consistency. I mean, I'm happy to treat things that are actually discreetly.
Consistency-ish, if you will.
Yeah, well, no, but the deeper consistency,
What is the deeper consistency?
Order.
Well, look, the other meta thing about this is that people lie all the time. The university tests. This is part of the conceit that, you're a good person, you're a good person, you're a good person, I'm a good person. We never lie. Only politicians lie. Only corporations lie. I was reading this in Tyler Cowen's Big Business, because it's like that's one of the ideas. It's like those terrible politicians and businesses, they're lying to us all the time, but I don't lie. I don't lie to my spouse, to my children, to the school board, when I'm trying to get into a zone, any of these things. But it's not actually backed up by the facts.
This might seem like making an obvious point, but how do you establish the truth?
Bureaucrats.
Yeah, exactly.
Something
like climate change.
But this is the ridiculous environment that we're in at the moment, because over the last decade or so, the left have gotten really upset about the idea that there are just so many lies in the press. So they've established these fact-checking units that draw in academia and geniuses and decide to come to a ruling about whether a politician or public commentator has said is true or not, and so you get these quote empirical tests about truth.
But they have an ingenious system for measuring this, though, which is a lie is anything that departs from their ideology. So it's
quite rigorous in a way.
And so it's actually ingenious, because having come up with this ideology like a story, then they look at things that don't match their ideology and they say, well, through a democratic process, we change that norm to match our ideology. Now it's not a lie anymore. Whereas you and I, who may have more of a connection to reality and expect that truth would be measured against the world as it really is, we're fighting with one hand tied behind our back, because we won't define our own lies as the truth, which is what they do.
That may be the first time you've ever said I have a connection to reality.
Yeah, well, I'm not so sure. I'm not so sure about you, Chris, but everyone else who's not enamoured of Michel Foucault.
It's war against postmodernism's broken out again. And I'm looking forward. We'll come back to that in the next time we have Andrew on the panel. Meanwhile, it's the season for it's AFL. W Draft Week, but it's also been the Nobel Prize season. We've had the Peace Prize awarded and the Prize for Economic Science, and both of these have put the focus on Africa and the developing world generally. How do we get economic growth and freedom into the developing world?
It has, Scott. So we talked briefly about the Nobel Prize for Economics, which was given to experimental development economics. But we also, in the interim week, Scott, we've been talking about how, well, in fact, the Nobel Prize for Peace is actually a really interesting example of development economics in action. So the Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed won the Nobel Peace Prize, and the specific reason that he won the prize was for ending a 20-year stalemate after a war between Ethiopia and Eritrea, which is obviously a great thing. But Ethiopia is a really interesting country. First of all, it's the fastest economically growing country in Africa. Ahmed himself is a reformist. He's launched a round of privatisations and institutional reforms. So when we were speaking last week and I was making the critique about the Nobel Prize winners in economics, that they weren't focused on institutional changes, well, it struck us that, in fact, this Prime Minister of Ethiopia actually is. And that's why we decided that, Pete, you would be a magnificent guest to have on the show because...
Thanks, guys.
In fact, you are a global expert on development economics through your PhD research, aren't you, Pete?
Well, I've almost finished my PhD. I feel like I've done my bit on development economics. It's up to Sinclair Davidson to read it.
But supervisor, to clarify.
And up to the rest of the world to follow closely.
Yeah. What I've put in there. So, what was the question? Sorry. I'm an expert. Yeah.
You've got your point out. Now, how do you think about these two strangely intersecting prizes?
Well, I think, I used to think the Nobel Peace Prize was stupid until they awarded someone that I liked as winning the award. But I think, it wasn't just for negotiating peace with Eritrea. He also released, 60,000 political prisoners, scrapped their civil society law. He's managed to sort of maintain this kind of peace for the moment within Ethiopia, although they did say at the moment that there's some ethnic violence going on, but that's like no mean feat. So he's done very well on that front. And he has, as you say, privatised some of the economic achievements. So it's a really positive thing. You have to be careful with people in countries like Ethiopia. It can change really quickly in people that start off great.
Yeah, his first action since being awarded the Nobel Peace Prize has been to start a fight with Egypt about a dam on the Nile. He was in the media last night saying that if needed, Ethiopia could raise an army of millions of men to fight for the dam. So although I don't know whether he's right or wrong about the dam, but I just thought that was like, on your point, these things can change
pretty quickly,
really quickly. And that gets to this, the thing that I was thinking about as I was reading about the Nobel Prize winners in economics, about development economics and things, and wondering whether the economic analysis can tell the whole story, in that my experience when I lived in a developing country, which was Peru, was that the fundamental problem wasn't necessarily the institutions as conceived, that there were a lot of people within the institutions or within the government working to have functioning institutions, but it was actually corruption, which isn't necessarily something that is captured. This is a question by the theory. I mean, the willingness basically to forego, in some sense, your immediate short-term interest to contribute to the development of an institution that over time will provide for the greater good. That seemed to be the root of the problem.
No, it is precisely captured by that. So I think we have to divide out when we, and Pete, you might jump in, but when we talk about the economic institutions, we're talking about how good quality is the rule of law, how responsive is the bureaucracy, is there, and it's measures like corruption. It's measures like, is there an opposition? So we can say that democracy is part of the, quote, economic institutions because it means you've got an open rather than a extractive environment where people are just trying to take rents and trying to take as much benefit out of the corrupt system as possible. And I think the difference, though, the difference between what we're talking about here and the Nobel winners in economics. So for those who missed the conversation last week, the Nobel winners in economics got their prize for running experimental development economics. So you'll do something like you'll take 2 villages and you'll give one village mosquito nets for free, and the other village you'll say 5 cents per mosquito net, and you'll see what the uptake is. And let's say if they pay for it, they value it more, then you'll say, okay, well, this is the policy now. We will give everyone in the country or everyone on the continent the 5 cent mosquito nets rather than free mosquito nets. And then you learn. It's a what works story of development, and it's not bad science. We might talk about some of the ethical questions in a moment, but it's not it does help us understand more about the world, but it doesn't give us those big buck hits, which are the institutional changes. It doesn't deal with the corruption problems. It doesn't deal with democracy problems. It doesn't get opposition leaders out of political prison and so forth.
Is that partly because, and sorry, Pete,
That's right.
Talk over the top of me at any time, but I mean, I've been hearing this story from economists and theorists and the Francis Fukuyamas and so on about it's about institutions, which it is, and it's about the development trajectory of various societies. This has been around for a long time, but it's also proven devilishly difficult to actually work out how to do that. It's all very well to say we need to build these institutions and eliminate corruption, but it doesn't seem to be getting any closer to working out how to do that, because understanding how it fits with a local culture, and it somehow has to be integrated with culture. And say in Africa there are different tribal groups which have their own distinct cultures. There's different religions everywhere, and it needs to be connected to that local culture to work. And so I'm very sympathetic to someone who just said, look, why are you guys trying to figure that out? I'm just going to try to figure out how to eradicate malaria.
How to get,
because malaria is bad.
Yeah.
I'd rather, I'm watching this thing on Bill Gates at the moment, and what the Gates Foundation is. I'm watching that on Netflix, and it's like polio was bad. He's trying to do cleaner toilets. It's the micro stuff while you guys are trying to figure out the macro stuff.
Yeah, and look, you're right. Like, institutional change is really hard, and corruption's a really big issue. I was in Cambodia and working for an organisation that was trying to fight corruption. It's like, how do you fight corruption when it's been the way we've done business for thousands of years? And these institutions take ages to change. And that's what you're talking about. Fortunately, I have a solution for you, Scott Hargreaves.
Yeah, great.
My notes have just gone to sleep. That's all right.
Yep.
So the Atlas Foundation is doing development differently that I've written about in the IPA review.
Yes.
They address the fact that institutional
program.
change is really difficult. So what they say is that we can't, make a place that doesn't have that has heaps of corruption suddenly not have corruption. We can't make them suddenly have a good legal system. But what we can do is make little changes around the margins to those institutions, which will actually benefit heaps of people. So, for example, in India, they reduced business regulation for registering your business, which allowed hundreds of thousands of people to come out of poverty. Like, a very tiny change. It's something manageable. It's not changing the whole system. It's not destroying a culture that's already there, but it makes a huge difference. So that's one way that you can do it. The other way is this guy is blockchain.
He was pointing at Berg then.
Yeah, pointing at Berg. I keep forgetting that most people listen to it. So, blockchain can challenge a lot of these institutions for entrepreneurs that don't want to.
Yeah, well, we had that example of property rights. So Hernando de Soto's sort of theory that, property rights are essential, which is absolutely right. And you can't, it's not like say, Victoria in the 19th century. You can't wait for Parliament to pass a law to introduce Torrens title. Mm-hmm. That's not going to work in the developing world. But you can just go into a village and start identifying property titles.
The insight here, and I thank you for raising blockchain.
That's all right.
That means I don't have to independently raise it myself. Yeah. But the insight here is that the problem that we have when we look at these corrupt institutions, we look at a legal system that you need to pay for service, that people get benefits out of that. So it's really hard to displace them. What if we didn't have to displace them? What if you could leave the existing legal institutions where they were and the people who are getting the benefits out of them still keep getting some of the benefits out of them. But you could build new institutions on top, like you layer them on top. And in that sense, what we want to be able to offer entrepreneurs who are operating in the developing world, we want to give them the choice. Do they want to write contracts that would be enforced in the potentially corrupt existing legal system? Or do we want to give them tools so they could write smart contracts on a blockchain that were self-enforcing? Now, not every problem is going to be able to do on both systems, but you're going to now build institutional competition, which is sort of what you have at the multinational level, because you've got a lot of global commercial arbitration courts and that sort of thing. But you want to provide that for small businesses as well, and you want to provide that for the entrepreneurs. And Pete, a few years ago when you and I were in Cambodia, and what really struck me, and has struck me since traveling around that region, is that there are so many small entrepreneurs, and the challenge that they have is it's not that they lack entrepreneurial mindset or anything. Yeah. It's that they lack capital in order to build business. They lack the capacity to write the long-term contracts that they need to expand their businesses.
Yeah. So that's going to benefit adapters, people who are capable of making this change. And then the counter argument would be that what would happen is that the existing institutions, corrupt as they are, sort of form a residual thing for people who can't adapt to the new system. Those people are left behind, trapped in a system that's suboptimal, and there's no incentive for the people who've migrated to the new system to actually help them. So
it's a dynamic process, though, because I mean, as more people move onto a better system than the existing system that gets so much benefits out of the fact that it had a monopoly, hopefully can start to compete, because they want to keep their rents. And they will continue to do so. But that's absolutely right. You're going to have you're going to have a bad system and a good system operating simultaneously, and not everybody will be able to use the good system, and not every economic activity will be able to use the smart contract system or what have you. But it's a hell of a lot better than what we have now.
Yeah, no, it's a bit like Uber taking over from taxis. You know, we spent years and years and years waiting for a reform to the taxi industry, but it was easier just to create a new one completely outside that system.
Set it up and see what happens.
I take your point about, but there's things we can do in the meantime until that happens. That's what basically everyone I argue about this on the radio says. It's like, yeah, but we can do all these things in the meantime. And there is sort of some logic to that. I sort of think William Easterly tells this great story about how, there's all these people dying of diseases we know how to fix, which costs like 5 cents to immunise them. But for 50 years, we've been trying to immunise them through foreign aid and it hasn't worked. Whereas, and what does he do? It's like, but on this day in 2008, 50 million kids in North America got Harry Potter books without anyone doing anything. So let's try and implement that system.
And what would be behind the Harry Potter system? What would be the distinguishing feature of that?
Free market.
Oh, what do you know? Free markets. Yep.
Extraordinary.
Extraordinary. Who knew? Everybody, as Gary Wolfram said on that video we have on the website, everyone in Manhattan woke up and was able to go and get their bagel. There was exactly the right number of bagels available so that there were no shortages. Who knew? We have reached that point of the program where we discuss our culture picks, what we've been reading, writing, or listening to. Who'd like to lead us off?
I'll have a go first. So I read last week, in fact, I read Edward Snowden's memoir, I guess, called Permanent Record, as everyone will remember. Edward Snowden was the NSA contractor. He was with Dell Company, among other companies, who was eventually the whistleblower, which you gave quotation marks, regarding the National Security Agency's programs that hoovered up massive quantities of data and metadata about...
I did think of using the word traitor, but...
Okay, all right. Well, we can get into that, Scott.
So-called whistleblower seemed like a good compromise.
I'll do the introduction and then you can share. Anyway, so the NSA's programs that hoovered up massive quantities of data and metadata about basically everything we do on the internet. So without batting around too much, was he a traitor? Is he a traitor? Exactly. What is he doing in Russia? That sort of thing. I had two big takeouts from the book. First of all, he's my age, so he remembers the internet as it was in the mid-1990s, which is sort of a nice nostalgia trip. He was more online than I was.
Chris isn't that old, everyone. He's like 35. How old are you?
37.
Okay, not that old.
I mean, I shouldn't have said. Now, so there are two big things. First of all, the disclosure that he made, regardless of whether it was the right or wrong thing to do, was the damage came from the fact that he disclosed it to the public, not to the enemies of the United States. And the reason I say that, it draws from, in fact, what Snowden was doing as a NSA contractor, because he speaks at length about a conference that he, in fact, presented at, outlining China's cyber surveillance capabilities himself, and making the point that the Chinese also obviously have classified conferences into what the West can do. So it's not like suddenly China knows that we can browse the internet really well. That just wasn't the case. To the extent that there was harm from those disclosures, the harm came from the fact that we learned about it. The second thing that I don't think is emphasised enough is the context. So the context in which the Snowden revelation should be understood in the debates that we're having right now. After the Snowden revelations, there was a massive public pushback against the big tech companies for allowing this to occur. And the finding, so he was a Dell contractor. They had worked very closely, the NSA this is, and the FBI and the CIA had worked very closely with Google, with Apple, all that sort of thing. And there was a huge public anger about the fact that the tech companies were working with the National Security Agency to violate everybody's privacy. In response to that, the tech companies introduced all this end-to-end encryption that now the NSA and the CIA and the FBI and Australia's ASIO and everybody is very upset about. The fact that all this knowledge came out is why we now have much safer and much more secure, I have to say, devices with end-to-end encryption. That's why Facebook Messenger is moving to end-to-end encryption. That's why everyone uses WhatsApp. That's why I recommend everyone uses Signal. That's why we're now in the environment we have, because of that backlash to the Snowden revelations, because those Snowden revelations showed the world, showed the public that there was just a massive violation of privacy going on. So look, it's not a brilliantly written book. It's interesting. It doesn't reveal too much more, but for people who were involved in that debate 3 years ago or in 2016 when it happened, it does have some interest, but mainly for that contextual story.
Interesting.
Where can they buy it?
Where can they buy it? From shops.
The internet.
The internet.
The internet thing encrypted. It'll be encrypted though.
He does actually imply that a number of people will pirate his book as well. So I don't know whether that's permission or
whether he's encouraging it.
Bootleg.
I might talk about a book I read some years ago, which is by Harold Bloom, who was a New York-based literary critic. Professor Harold Bloom, he wrote this book, which what I am holding up, called Western Canon, The Books and Schools of the Ages. I've linked to, I wrote a review of that in 100 Great Books of Liberty, a terrific IPA publication, which I've now reposted online. And so because everyone listening is, of course, going to go and look that up and read it, I won't redo the whole thing. There is a terrific, it is a classic argument for the validity of a canon, that there are these great books. They're just great. And you should read them.
Is that what he says?
And you should read them, yeah.
The other pages are just blank. This is one.
It's just a list.
Here's a list of books. These are great. Read them.
He does have a list of books up the end, actually, which is now online. I found it actually on the University of Adelaide website last night, so I'll include that. These are the 1,400 things you should actually read.
I've seen a criticism of Harold Bloom's Western Canon that it's basically a long list of reasons that books are good, but or long explanation of why certain books are good or plays are good. But there's no sort of argument. Do you think that's right?
Well, there you go. Funnily enough. So I was about to say I'm not going to go through that list.
Okay.
And because he specifically avoids a conservative argument. The conservative argument is you should read these books because they'll make you a better person.
Okay.
You'll learn this moral framework from reading, Jane Austen or whoever. His argument, I think, is fundamentally individualist and liberal one, and it's actually almost evolutionist in the sense that he believes that the distinguishing feature of the modern age is individualism, and the distinguishing figure of the modern age is Hamlet, essentially, and that essentially up until about that point in human history, it was all collective, and fate was the explanation, and so this is why for him Shakespeare is above everyone else in the canon, because he identified that transition. So when there's that famous line, the fault, Brutus, lies not in the stars but in ourselves. This was a radical notion, because for all of recorded history, people had looked at the stars and said, well, if my life's a disaster, it's because the gods have been smiting me again, or if there's thunder and lightning, the gods have been fighting. And instead it's like, no, it's in us. And so you get Hamlet with his interminable soliloquies, but how amazing are they? Because he's saying these things out loud, and Bloom has a literary theory, he calls it self-overhearing, that you discover this inner voice, and Bushnell's probably going to hate this, but it's not quite divine spark, but you start listening to your own voice and overhearing yourself, and you develop this notion of the individual, and on the foundation of that notion of individualism is all of our notions of freedom as individuals and the sovereignty of the individual. So there's a lot to the book. There is a canon, and it will defend particular writers, but I think there is, and the reason why I argued for it to be in 100 Great Books of Liberty is that this is the connection between the literature of the West and freedom, and it's actually an essential understanding, I think.
The recognition that the individual is flawed, is a fallen character, probably predates Shakespeare. But the question is, what do you do about that? So do you think that the individual is perfectible, or do you think that noting his limitations, that the fault is within ourselves, actually means that there are certain things you're just going to have to accept about the world? So anyway, that was just the thought.
No.
I thought Bushnell was a divine spark guy.
No, I'm the
They're
the opposite.
Gnostics.
Yeah.
I've got to read Big Ideas more.
You accused me of Gnosticism. No, that's nicely framed, though, as a further question. I think Bloom would say, and literature is how we explore that very question. So read books, everyone. They're very
Read
good.
books to conclude.
To conclude. Or watch old movies. And,
Yeah, well, so
Speaking of
here's one that should be in the canon. I have an infant son. He's 4 months old, and one of the things that I've discovered is that when I'm looking after him, I find it very hard to watch things that I've never seen before, because I can go in and out of things that I've seen before. So I was watching on the weekend a favourite movie of mine, and if you've watched a lot of movies, I know Chris, you have. If you've watched a lot of movies, one of the great things about watching lots of movies is trying to find like a B movie that you think is actually really good, like that has something to say it's more interesting than your normal B movie.
Like the Mighty Ducks.
So this one is called To Live and Die in LA. It's the last great movie made by William Friedkin, who's most famous for The French Connection.
And The Exorcist.
And The Exorcist, which he made in the early 70s. This is from the mid-80s. This is one of the great, most 80s movies ever. It has original music by Wang Chung.
Oh, wow.
The opening set piece is a terrorist trying to kill Ronald Reagan. The protagonist is a flawed Secret Service agent played by a bow leg of ham called William Peterson, who you might know from CSI, the original one. Anyway, there was a brief moment in the mid-80s where this guy was a movie star, and he's the protagonist in this. And anyway, what's great about this movie is it has all these 80s elements, but it kind of emerges throughout the movie, and rewatching it on the weekend, that it's almost like a critique of the kind of macho 80s cop character. So he gets involved in this, and it turns out that he's actually like a really difficult, sort of awful person for the other people in his life. And And anyway, as the movie progresses, it becomes more apparent that he's in over his head. He doesn't know it. He's a lot dumber than he probably realizes. And so anyway, it's
both
just
stupid and toxic.
yeah, it's just like
What a
so
combo.
Yeah, so it's this great like starts out as this like 80, it's got this 80s soundtrack and it's cars driving, it's
Sort
like
of
kind of
Miami
Michael,
Vice
kind of like a
sort of,
Michael Mann kind of thing. And then as it goes on, you're like, this guy sucks. So anyway, I definitely recommend that one for if you
Some
like
layers
Friedkin, if you like 80s B movies and you like detective things, and if you like the music of Wang Chung, definitely get around to Live and Die in LA.
Never seen it. We'll definitely go to look that one up.
There you go. Am I up? So I know we haven't got much time left, so I'll bang through it. But I recently watched season 5 of Peaky Blinders. So a lot of people out there would have watched previous series. But if you haven't, the Peaky Blinders are a Birmingham razor gang from the 20s who are called the Peaky Blinders because they keep razor blades in their caps that they then cut your eyes out with. So, and one of the problems I have with this is that I end up barracking for them because, they're the main characters, but they're horrible people that kill people.
But this is the thing, I couldn't get into this show because who am I supposed to like?
Yeah, exactly. I like them. Yeah, exactly. So I have that problem as well. Like
I watched season 1. I was a bit the same. I thought I'm not going to stick with this.
Okay, yeah. So obviously we're 1 out of 3 so far on Peaky Blinders, but I end up liking these murderers, and so
and it's got that guy. He was in Dark Knight, wasn't he? Chilean.
I think it's Cillian, but Cillian Murphy.
Yeah.
So
he was when they set up the revolutionary tribunals and society had collapsed. He was the one who was let out of the asylum.
Yeah, he was
Scarecrow.
Which is always fun because he's in a lot of Ken Loach movies, and Ken Loach is a famously left-wing socialist. So I was like, oh yeah, this is...
Who recently voiced a great opinion.
Yes. we'll get to that in a moment. Finish your...
Oh, that's right. Yeah, so anyways...
There's a thing going on in movies at the moment.
One of the things is the acting's awesome, and Cillian Murphy's one of them, and there's a couple of others. Sam Neill's in it. I thought Sam Neill was Australian until 10 minutes before this podcast when I was researching this. He's actually from New Zealand.
Oh, we claim him, mate.
Okay.
Any Kiwi that's any good, we'll claim.
Anyway, I won't bang on about it too long. It's great fun. It's not there's no major point to it. It's great fun. It's beautifully shot. The acting's great. It's intersecting with some interesting historical times. They just get back from the war. There's this battle between the cavalry and the infantrymen, the working class and upper class. He ends up going all the way to Parliament by series 5.
No way.
And he joins they lose heaps of money in the crash.
Does he keep the razor blade? And
he ditches them, but his mates still do because they lose all this money in the crash and have to do a little bit more criminal activity to keep the money flowing in. Anyway, he ends up joining with the British Union of Fascists as like a plot, as a what's it called, like a double agent to try and kill. Oh, I shouldn't. Well, I'll say he attempts to kill Oswald Mosley. And I won't say whether it happens or not.
This is how you make him sympathetic, right? So he is this criminal, kills people, all this thing. Well, who can he possibly have as an antagonist?
Go after a Nazi.
A fascist.
Yeah.
And Oswald again.
So we do have to talk about the very important thing that's going on in the cinema world at the moment that I've been following very closely. But Andrew, why don't you give a rundown?
So Ken Loach is the latest of these old white male directors. Martin Scorsese.
Francis Ford Coppola
have previously voiced the same sentiment, which is that comic book movies, and in particular the Marvel Cinematic Universe, are not cinema. They're not art.
They're not cinema, please.
Coppola called it Coppola described them as theme parks.
Yep.
And I think...
And despicable.
Which
is strong.
And the response to this, of course, from the people who make these movies and have sold out and have sort of basically given up their talents to do this, is that
Jon Favreau, we're talking about you, mate.
It's just the same as if I was making a western, or it's the same as if I was making a gangster movie in the 30s. It's just the genre, but there's still some real art involved. And of course, the response to that is, westerns were shot with cameras in the desert. There was a whole lot of challenges that went into making even a B movie.
But challenges don't make it up, though, to be fair.
But standing in front of a green screen going, woo, in front of,
where the green screen behind us,
as some sort of stagehand waves like a moving piece of green fabric in front of you that you have to pretend is something. No,
but there is this dispute comes off the back of, and was it last week or the week before we spoke about someone had gone to see The Joker, or was it you, Scott?
Bolt.
And the Joker
Sacked it.
is like an attempt at building an art movie within the constraints of a superhero genre, because apparently you can't make movies that aren't the superhero genre. So if you're going to tell a story about a disaffected young man, it has to be, Batman's nemesis.
Yeah, and then you debut it at the Venice Film Festival, to try to make it an art movie.
Which is just a weird thing that's happened. And I guess, in the sense that they're trying to make movies out of superhero genre, then I guess that's a good thing. But wouldn't you say?
Like the superhero genre, like as a specific thing, is terrible. But the superhero story is much broader. So, for example, Gladiator is a superhero movie in reality. So there's an origin story in the first act, and then he has this like incredible fighting power. He's essentially invincible. And the story progresses in basically the same way. Here is one man against the empire, has a particular talent, uses it to save the world, essentially.
Has a nemesis.
Yeah, so it's more or less a superhero story.
This is very Joseph Campbell of you, I have to say. There's the idea that there's only one real story.
No. There's at least 12. But the point is, it's not the story arc itself. It's all the things that go into telling these stories. It's all the fan service. It's all the Chinese Communist Party service. It's all of the decisions that are made along the way to turn it into the most maximally profitable product that compromises it as an art form. I think that's what Scorsese is trying to say, because he's not against spending $150 million to de-age Robert De Niro for his latest Netflix movie.
Yes.
Okay? So he's not against that.
He's not anti-selling out, to be clear.
That's right.
Spending a lot of money to do, digital. Every single shot in The Wolf of Wall Street is a digital composite. Right. Almost every single shot.
Wow.
People don't know that.
So he drove into the uncanny valley with The Irishman. I think I stuck up, by the way, the last time we talked about the Marvel Cinematic Universe. I think I said, well, yeah, but what about Thor 3 with what's his name, Watiki, and as director? And I think, Andrew, you said that's one. That's 1 out of 50. I'll give you that one, and that was about it. I'd like to say thank you very much to our panellists today, Chris Berg.
Thank you, Scott.
Andrew Bushnell.
Thank you.
And a huge thanks to our for coming over from the other podcast, Pete Gregory.
No problem. Thanks for having me.
So we'll call you, don't we?
Don't worry, yeah. Stand by that phone. One day it will ring. And, of course, the aforementioned producer for Looking Forward, Josh Stranger. We'll be back with more Looking Forward next week.